Nobody ever stood at a podium and said the middle class was ending. There was no emergency announcement, no breaking news banner, no moment where people were told to brace themselves. Life looked normal. Paychecks still arrived. Stores stayed open. Suburbs stayed quiet. But under that calm surface, something important was being slowly rewritten. The rules that once made a middle-class life predictable were adjusted in small, technical ways that most people never noticed at the time. Not because they weren't paying attention, but because the changes were designed to feel routine. What actually happened wasn't a collapse. Collapses are loud. This was a redesign. Piece by piece, the structure that allowed average workers to build stability was altered. Not all at once, and not in one place. The changes were spread across tax codes, labor policies, corporate practices, and local regulations. Each adjustment on its own seemed reasonable, even boring. Together, they quietly changed what a paycheck could do and how far a family could plan ahead. One of the first shifts happened in how work itself was valued. Wages didn't stop growing completely, but they stopped growing in a way that matched real-life costs. Raises became smaller and less frequent. Bonuses replaced base pay. Overtime became harder to qualify for. Schedules became more flexible on paper and more unpredictable in reality. For employers, it reduced risk. For workers, it introduced constant uncertainty. A job could still exist, but the stability attached to it slowly disappeared. At the same time, benefits began to thin out. Health coverage became more expensive, even when employers still offered it. Deductibles climbed quietly. Copays multiplied. Retirement plans shifted from guaranteed outcomes to individual responsibility. The message was subtle but consistent. Long-term security was no longer something institutions would promise. It became something individuals were expected to manage alone, regardless of their income or circumstances. Housing followed the same pattern of quiet restriction. Zoning laws limited what could be built. New housing slowed while demand kept rising. Homes turned into financial assets rather than places to live. Prices didn't spike overnight. They crept year after year. A starter home moved just slightly out of reach. Rent followed close behind. For many families, the cost of shelter began to absorb the raises they did receive, turning progress into maintenance rather than advancement. Then there were the changes that felt too small to matter at first. New fees, new fines, new charges labeled as convenience or service costs. Banking shifted from relationship-based to transaction-based. Missing a payment once could trigger penalties that snowballed. Everyday services became subscriptions. Things that were once included became add-ons. None of these expenses were large enough to feel like a crisis on their own, but they stacked up, month after month, year after year, quietly draining the margin that once allowed people to save. What made this process so effective was that it didn't require force. No one had to be removed from their job or home all at once. People adjusted. They cut back. They worked longer hours. They delayed milestones. They took on side work. Each adaptation made the next adjustment feel necessary rather than alarming. The system didn't break people. It trained them to absorb the pressure. Technology improved. Output increased. The economy, by many measures, was growing. But the gains were increasingly captured elsewhere. Ownership and leverage mattered more than labor. Those who already had assets benefited from appreciation. Those who relied on wages felt stuck, even as they worked harder than previous generations. The most important detail is this: at no point did it feel like a single decision. There was no vote that said the middle class would shrink. There was no law labeled as removal. Instead, there were hundreds of small adjustments that slowly changed the math of everyday life, enough to make saving harder, enough to make planning riskier, enough to turn stability into something that felt temporary. By the time many people sensed something was wrong, it was already normal. Children grew up watching their parents juggle costs instead of build wealth. Adults recalibrated expectations downward without ever naming why. The middle class didn't disappear. It was slowly redesigned out of reach, one reasonable change at a time. What replaced that stability wasn't chaos. It was something quieter and far more efficient. An economy that doesn't need to collapse people outright, because it can extract from them slowly instead. This is the part most explanations skip, because it doesn't fit neatly into charts or headlines. Growth can still look healthy while pressure quietly increases underneath. The system doesn't have to fail. It just has to take a little more each month than it gives back. This is where the shift becomes harder to see. Traditional economics focuses on production, jobs created, goods sold, services delivered. But over time, a different layer expanded on top of that extraction. Money that doesn't come from making something new, but from skimming, fees, interest, rent, penalties, and mandatory charges that attach themselves to everyday life. These costs don't feel like purchases. They feel unavoidable. For middle-income households, extraction hits especially hard because it targets consistency. Rent is due every month, interest compounds quietly, fees trigger automatically. None of these require a bad decision or a financial mistake. They simply require participation in modern life. Housing, healthcare, transportation, communication, all of it now carries built-in tolls that must be paid before any progress can be made. Take housing, rent doesn't just rise, it resets expectations. Each increase becomes the new baseline. Moving doesn't fix it because the surrounding market moves together. Owning, once a way to stabilize costs, now demands higher entry prices, larger down payments, and long-term debt exposure that stretches decades. Shelter stops being a foundation and becomes a constant drain on future income. Debt works the same way. Interest turns time into a liability. Even modest balances linger longer, absorbing money that could have gone toward savings or security. The longer someone remains in the middle, the more likely they are to rely on credit for normal life expenses, not luxuries, but repairs, medical costs, education, and transitions between jobs. Extraction doesn't punish recklessness. It feeds on necessity. Then there are the charges people barely notice anymore. Banking fees for being a few dollars short, insurance premiums that rise without explanation, co-pays that appear at every appointment, subscription renewals that quietly continue after the free period ends, parking tolls, service charges, processing fees. Each one is small enough to ignore, but together they reshape the monthly budget. What used to be surplus turns into maintenance. What makes this model powerful is that it feels neutral. No one has to argue for it. Algorithms enforce it, contracts automate it. The rules are written in fine print and executed by software. Responsibility shifts entirely to the individual, even when the system itself creates the pressure. If you fall behind, it feels personal, not structural. This is also why the damage is uneven but widespread. High earners can absorb extraction without noticing. Low-income households often qualify for limited relief programs. The middle sits in between, earning too much for assistance, but not enough to outrun the drain. Every year, a slightly larger share of income is committed before choices can be made. Over time, this changes behavior. People stop thinking in decades and start thinking in months. Long-term plans feel risky. Saving feels pointless when costs are unpredictable. Financial anxiety becomes a background condition, not a crisis moment. The economy still functions, stores stay open, jobs exist, but forward motion slows to a crawl. This is why it feels like something is missing rather than broken. The money is moving, but it's circulating upward and outward instead of settling into households. The middle class wasn't pushed down in one blow. It was held in place while value was quietly pulled away. By the time these pressures show up in charts, they've already lived inside people for years. Numbers lag reality. What really reveals what happened to the middle class are the small, personal decisions people now make without thinking about them. Choices that once felt temporary now feel permanent. Not because people gave up, but because the environment changed around them. Consider the teacher who never planned to leave the profession. The job still exists. The title still carries respect. But the math no longer works the way it used to. A second job appears, not as a crisis move, but as a smart adjustment. Tutoring in the evenings, summer work that used to be optional now becomes necessary. The paycheck didn't disappear. Its purpose quietly shifted from building a future to maintaining the present. Retirement contributions shrink first, savings pause. The workload expands, and exhaustion becomes normal. Then there's the factory worker who did everything right. Decades of steady employment, loyalty to one company, a clear path. When the plant closed or automated, it wasn't dramatic. No scandal, just a notice and a timeline. The new job pays less, but it's framed as flexible. The schedule changes weekly, benefits are thinner. The income gap is filled with gig work, driving, delivering, patching together hours. Life becomes a puzzle of availability. Time itself turns into the scarce resource, even more than money. Look at housing through the eyes of a renter who did what they were told to do, saved consistently, avoided risky debt, waited patiently. Each year, the target moved. Prices rose faster than savings. Down payments grew while wages stalled. Rent increased in the meantime, absorbing the money meant for progress. Eventually, the goal shifts from ownership to stability. Not buying a home, but just not being forced to move again. These stories don't feel like failure to the people living them. They feel like adaptation. That's the part that often gets misunderstood. People didn't suddenly become irresponsible or lazy. They became flexible. They recalibrated. They adjusted expectations downward without being asked to. What used to feel like a temporary squeeze became the new normal. Even families that appear comfortable feel it. Dual incomes that once meant security now feel barely sufficient. Childcare costs absorb entire paychecks. Healthcare decisions are delayed or negotiated. Vacations shrink. Emergency funds quietly disappear after one unexpected expense. From the outside, life looks stable. Inside, everything feels fragile. This fragility changes behavior in subtle ways. People stay in jobs they dislike because the risk of change feels too high. They avoid speaking up. They postpone having children or decide not to at all. They move farther from work to afford housing, trading money for time. Commutes lengthen. Community involvement declines. Energy is conserved for survival tasks rather than growth. Debt becomes a companion rather than a tool. Not dramatic, not reckless, just persistent. A balance that never fully disappears. A payment that never quite ends. Interest turns yesterday's necessity into tomorrow's burden. The future arrives already partially spent. What's striking is how quietly this happened. There were no riots, no mass walkouts. People internalized the pressure and kept going. They blamed themselves. They assumed others were doing better. Social media reinforced the illusion. Everyone looked fine, so it must have been a personal problem. This is how a middle class is removed without anyone noticing in real time. Not through collapse, but through normalization. Through millions of individuals making rational choices in an environment that no longer rewards long-term stability. Each person adapts. Collectively, the class itself thins out, and once that thinning begins, it feeds on itself. Fewer people with margin means fewer people able to take risks, start businesses, or invest locally. Neighborhoods change. Schools feel it. Local economies lose their buffer. What remains looks functional, but it lacks resilience. By the time people start asking what happened, the answer feels abstract. Policy, markets, global forces. But the truth is visible in daily routines, in how tired people are, in how carefully they calculate, in how the idea of getting ahead quietly transformed into the goal of simply not falling behind. Once a class thins out, the effects don't stay confined to bank accounts. They spread into behavior, trust, and how people relate to the country itself. This is where the removal becomes social, not just economic. When stability disappears slowly, it doesn't produce outrage right away. It produces distance. People pull back from systems that no longer feel designed for them. One of the first things to go is trust. Not in any single institution, but in the idea that institutions work together in a way that makes effort feel worthwhile. Rules begin to feel arbitrary. Outcomes feel disconnected from hard work. People stop expecting fairness and start expecting friction. This doesn't turn everyone angry. It turns many people quiet, cynical, detached. Politics absorbs this pressure, not because everyone becomes ideological, but because frustration looks for an outlet. When material security weakens, symbolic conflicts grow louder. Cultural battles become substitutes for economic ones. People argue over identity, language, and loyalty, while the underlying issue remains untouched. The sense that something has been taken without consent hardens into resentment, even when no single villain can be named. Community life changes too. The middle class once acted as a stabilizer, volunteering, maintaining local institutions, participating in civic routines. As time and money margins shrink, those activities feel optional, then burdensome, then unrealistic. Attendance drops. Organizations struggle. Neighborhoods feel more transient. People move more often, know each other less, and invest emotionally only where it's absolutely necessary. This erosion also reshapes how people think about the future. Long-term planning gives way to short-term survival logic. People become cautious rather than ambitious. Risk feels dangerous, not exciting. Starting something new, a business, a family, a move, feels like a gamble with no safety net. The country doesn't stop moving forward, but it moves with hesitation instead of confidence. Even national mood shifts. Optimism becomes conditional. Hope turns into skepticism. Good news is met with suspicion rather than relief. Promises are discounted before they're evaluated. This isn't apathy, it's learned restraint. When people have adjusted too many times, they stop believing adjustment will ever lead back to stability. What makes this moment fragile is that it can't be fixed with surface-level solutions. You can't restore trust with slogans. You can't rebuild a middle class with one program or one election. Removal took decades through countless small decisions. Reversal requires acknowledging the design itself, not just its outcomes. The danger isn't that people will suddenly rebel, it's that they will quietly disengage, that they will stop believing the system is meant to include them. A society can function like that for a long time, but it becomes brittle. It loses its ability to absorb shocks. When stress arrives, economic, political, or environmental, there is less margin, less patience, and less shared purpose to withstand it. The middle class was never just about income. It was about predictability, about the belief that effort today could reasonably lead to stability tomorrow. When that belief fades, something fundamental changes. Not all at once, not loudly, but deeply. And that is the final result of a slow removal. A country that still works, still produces, still moves, but does so without the quiet confidence that once held everything together.